I recently explained why Cyno is the only 5-star character I regret pulling for so far, and while many people felt the same, some made some interesting suggestions for how to solve my complaints. I promised to take a look, so here we are. What were the suggestions, did they fix Cyno for me, and what was the most important trick I learned along the way? To recap, right from the start I loved Cyno's character, aesthetics and playstyle, but felt he had some major problems. When fighting the hardest content in the game, his team's damage was nowhere near the heights of my main team's. When using him in the overworld, if I used his burst, everything nearby would die too fast, leaving him with no energy left. If I didn't use his burst, his damage was painfully low. I enjoyed his playstyle in spite of this, so when people suggested a completely different build with a different team focus and said it would make his teams as powerful as my main ones, I couldn't wait to try it. While testing this new build, I also had a realization which completely changed how useful he is in the overworld as well. Originally, I had built my Cyno for the catalyze reactions, which involve only the Dendro and Electro elements. Let's give a quick overview of these reactions, then explain how I built Cyno with those in mind, before we then go on to the suggested changes and how they work differently. The first step in the catalyze reaction group is to hit an enemy with both Dendro and Electro. The two elements can coexist. They combine into a new status called Quickened, which doesn't really do anything other than sit there waiting for further interactions. If you then hit the Quickened enemy with more Dendro or Electro, you trigger a secondary reaction which consumes the Quickened aura and causes extra damage. Quicken plus Dendro triggers a reaction called Spread, Quicken plus Electro triggers a reaction called Aggravate. So how do we build a character to best make use of these reactions? Both Aggravate and Spread have the same fairly simple effect. They add extra damage to your character's attacks. Reactions which work like this are called additive reactions, not to be confused with more common amplifying reactions which multiply your damage. Due to the way the damage for these reactions works, it's generally best to aim for a fairly typical elemental DPS build. For Cyno, this means aiming for a decent amount of attack, as much electro damage bonus as possible, a healthy crit ratio, and ideally good elemental mastery, since not only does that make for a stronger aggravate reaction, Cyno's passive also converts EM into damage. For my original Cyno build, I gave him the Jade Spear, along with a 4-piece Gladiator artifact set with very good stats, resulting in a very strong build. I've lost track of the exact artifacts I had, but this one is roughly similar, with over 2000 attack, very strong crit, and a good amount of energy recharge, although I recall the EM being a little low even then. It was a fairly good build for the original intended team, but people recommended a different approach. Instead of focusing on the catalyze reactions, many recommended trying Cyno out in a Hyper Bloom or Quick Bloom team. Let's take a quick look at how Hyper Bloom works. The first step in this reaction group is to hit an enemy with a Dendro and Hydro. These elements react to create a Dendro core. If left to its own devices, the Dendro core will eventually explode, causing damage to nearby enemies. However, if you hit it with Electro, the core will shoot off and hit the closest enemy, causing even more damage. This extra reaction between the Dendro core and the Electro element is called Hyper Bloom. Hyper Bloom's damage calculation works completely differently to the catalyze reactions we covered earlier, and as a result, the character build for Hyper Bloom looks very different. Hyper Bloom ignores the character's attack, elemental damage, and crit stats, and instead depends on the main character level and elemental mastery stat. The term for reactions which function like this is transformative reactions. A Hyper Bloom build then focuses almost entirely on making the character's elemental mastery stat as high as possible, with the other stats being just nice to have. Since my EM artifacts aren't that great, my build dials back the EM a little bit so that I can keep a decent level of attack and crit for his own non-Hyper Bloom damage, which gave me better results. I did try a full EM build as well, using the Dragonsbane Spear, which resulted in stronger Hyper Bloom, but overall I preferred the Hyper build with my original spear. Now that I had built Cyno differently, I tried him in a bunch of teams with various characters. The second and third slots in the team were always reserved for Dendro and Hydro character, since that's the minimum requirement for the Bloom reaction. The Dendro characters I tried were Nahida, Yao Yao, and Traveler, while the Hydro characters I tried were Barbara, Kokomi, Xingqiu, and Yilan. While I often picked a fourth character from those options to provide double Dendro or double Hydro, I also tested teams with Beidou and Layla for their shields, and some with Sucrose for her crowd control. While many of the combinations I tried had some significant disadvantages, I really enjoyed most of them, and they were all noticeably stronger than my previous Cyno teams. Naturally, any team including Nahida's stood out as the strongest due to her super fast Ender application and EM buff, but for the most part, the overall damage was surprisingly consistent regardless of which characters were included or which Cyno build I was testing. I particularly enjoyed the teams involving Sucrose even without Nahida, since her crowd control is highly useful and the extra EM boost makes a big difference. Note that some of these teams are considered Quick Bloom rather than Hyper Bloom because they apply less Hydro, and as a result, the Quicken reactions cause a more significant amount of the team's damage. Overall, these teams feel a lot closer to the strength of my main Abyss teams, which was great to see. It's also very fun to play, so I'm extremely happy with this approach and I will be using my Cyno a lot more going forward, so thanks again to everyone who made those suggestions on the original video. So that's a big improvement against difficult content, but what about Cyno in the overworld? Making him even more powerful would surely make this side of the coin even worse, right? I hinted earlier that I had figured out something for this. It's actually two related things, which is something I'd never seen mentioned anywhere before. Perhaps I and everyone else who had problems with Cyno just missed them somehow. First, when messing around with how to time Cyno's skill during his burst to line up with the damage boost symbols, it dawned on me that the skill cooldown was a full second shorter than the time between the symbols appearing. This difference is large enough that there's actually enough time to insert an extra use of the skill straight after using his burst. The next skill use will still line up with the symbol, so there's no disadvantage to doing this. Second, using Cyno's burst reduces his skill cooldown even if the cooldown started before the burst was cast. If you use his skill directly before using his burst, then once the burst animation ends, the skill cooldown will have around 1 second left instead of the 4 seconds remaining which you'd expect. By combining these two insights, we can change Cyno's rotation just a little bit and solve most of his energy needs in the process. If you time it right, the energy particles from the initial skill are collected after the burst begins, and by adding the extra skill a second after the burst animation, will regenerate a full 1/3 of Cyno's energy straight away. This not only makes him a heck of a lot more usable against weaker enemies in the overworld, but it also opens up more flexibility in his other team rotations. Before realizing this, I always needed to spend more time with Cyno on the field to recharge his burst, which meant that he didn't work well with support characters who had shorter buff durations. The extra energy this trick provides increases his synergy with these characters, and his teams feel even smoother and more powerful as a result. Regret after pulling for a character is a terrible feeling, so I'm overjoyed to have been able to find solutions to my problems. Thank you everyone who reached out and gave me the push to not give up on him and to keep experimenting. Hopefully this video can be helpful to all the other people who found themselves in a similar situation. Until next time!